The shadows move away temporarily, leaving an unsettling silence in the square. Elena, John, Sarah, and Claire exchange determined looks, as the dark entity's voice echoes one last time, promising that it will return to claim Havenbrook. The dark promise hangs over them, and everyone realizes that the truce is only temporary. Last Stand. Episode 4. Havenbrook is plunged into an oppressive silence. Elena watches the ruined city intently, feeling the weight of the impending confrontation. Shadows stir at the edges of the city, as if preparing to attack again. The few survivors are exhausted, but Elena knows they need a definitive solution or they will all be lost. In a moment of determination, she declares, "It's time to end this." Shadows Below. Episode 4. After the brief retreat from the shadows, the town of Havenbrook finds itself in a state of constant alert. Every corner, every alley carries a feeling of imminent danger, and the few remaining residents experience a mix of panic and resignation, knowing that the entity has not given up. Elena, determined to find a way to break the pact, brings together John, Sarah, and Claire and decides to divide tasks to investigate ancient places where the pact could have been sealed. Elena and John are tasked with investigating the old cemetery, where they believe they can find traces of the founders. The place, covered by years of neglect and haunted by stories of disappearances, is shrouded in dense shadows that seem more alive than ever. Sarah and Claire in turn head to an abandoned house that, according to records, belonged to one of Havenbrook's founding leaders, someone deeply involved in the original pact. Scene in the cemetery. Elena and John arrive at the cemetery, feeling the thick, cold air around them. Each tomb seems to emanate a heavy energy, and the silence around is so absolute that any sound, even the slight movement of leaves, seems like a muffled scream. They walk through the rows of tombstones until they find an ancient mausoleum, covered in moss and cracks. John approaches and sees an almost erased inscription. "Here lies Edward Hawthorne, keeper of Havenbrook's dark promise." Reading these words gives them both goosebumps, as the inscription confirms Edward Hawthorne's connection with the pact. John examines the door of the mausoleum and notices that, amid the worn decorations, there are symbols that resemble those of the amulet he carries. When you press your hand against the door, the stone begins to vibrate slightly and emits a low sound, almost like a lament. "This place was meant to seal something," John murmurs, more to himself than to Elena. Elena, ever pragmatic, asks, "Do you think he might have left some way to help us break this pact?" John shakes his head, uncertain. "If there's a chance, it's in here." With effort, they push the mausoleum's heavy door open, which opens with a deep creak. Inside, everything is dark, and the flashlight that John holds barely illuminates the room. On the walls, they notice engravings depicting scenes of a dark ritual, where several human figures seem to offer something to a figure cloaked in shadows. The representation is frighteningly clear, a sacrifice in exchange for a promise. As they explore, an intense cold invades the space. The shadows around them seem to writhe, and Elena and John begin to hear low whispers, which intensify, filling the space with voices that echo the words, "The debt will be paid." They exchange panicked looks, aware that the entity has found them. John quickly holds the amulet, trying to protect them both with the weak light it can still emit. But something else appears in the darkness, a translucent figure, with an expression of despair and pain, as if trapped in an eternal cycle of torment. The figure murmurs disjointed words, which indicate previous resistance, a failed attempt to break the pact. Elena, trying to remain calm, asks the figure, "You tried to break your promise, didn't you?" The spirit looks at her and with a voice that sounds like a distant lament responds, "I failed." The entity cannot be broken without a final sacrifice. The spirit's words resonate heavily. John realizes that they will need something beyond courage and resistance to face the entity. Elena, determined, asks the spirit if there is any hope, but before he can respond, he is sucked back into the darkness, as if the entity itself is pulling at his strength. Frightened, but aware that they need to act quickly, they leave the mausoleum and head back to the city center, where they will reunite with Sarah and Claire to share what they have discovered. Meanwhile, Sarah and Claire arrive at the abandoned house. an imposing structure, but destroyed by time. The windows are covered in dust, and the doors creak with a sound that seems to echo throughout the deserted city. As soon as they enter, the temperature seems to drop drastically, and a smell of mold and rotting wood invades their senses. "Do you think we'll find anything useful here?" Sarah asks, trying to hide her nervousness. Claire responds, trying to sound firm, "If any of the founders lived here, there might be some clue about the pact. We just need to be careful." They begin searching the house, cautiously climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath their feet. When they arrive upstairs, they find an old office, with furniture covered in dust and a desk full of yellowed papers. Among the papers, Claire finds a letter written by one of the founders. The letter describes the pact made with the shadow entity and mentions a sacred object, an artifact that, if used in the right place and at the right time, could seal the entity forever. The letter indicates that the object was hidden at the edge of the forest, near an ancient altar where the pact was made. Sarah looks at the letter, her heart racing. "Then there is a way. If we can find this altar, maybe we can put an end to this." But before they can process the information, a shadow begins to form in the corner of the room. They freeze at the sight of the entity, which materializes before them, its red eyes glowing with hatred and fury. Sarah and Claire try to escape, but the room's doors slam shut, leaving them trapped with the creature. The entity whispers, its voice a menacing echo. "Do you think you can escape the fate of Havenbrook? This covenant is eternal." Claire, trying to remain calm, raises the flashlight, but the light seems to go out under the entity's power. They retreat until they are cornered against the wall, but before the creature attacks them, a loud sound of footsteps resounds down the stairs. It is Elena and John, who arrived in time. John lifts the amulet and, with all the energy he has left, recites the words that the spirit in the mausoleum muttered earlier. The amulet's light shines brightly, and the entity temporarily retreats, disappearing into the shadows. They take the opportunity to leave the house, taking with them the letter describing the sacred artifact. John lifts the amulet with his last strength, uttering the words he heard from the spirit in the mausoleum. His voice comes out hesitant, but as he continues, it becomes stronger and more decisive. An intense light emerges from the amulet, as if reacting to John's challenge. The dark entity, which seemed about to swallow Sarah and Claire, momentarily retreats. His red eyes lose some of their brightness, and the darkness around him falters, as if hesitating. The whispers cease, leaving an almost absolute silence in the room. For a moment, everyone remains motionless, trying to understand if this temporary truce is real. But John knows the effect is temporary. They only have a few seconds before the entity reforms itself and attacks them with full force again. "Let's get out of here. Now," he says, his voice firm, breaking the silence. Sarah and Claire, still in shock from the encounter, react quickly, following John towards the exit of the house. As they run, Elena hurries to collect the letter with instructions about the sacred artifact and hides it under her coat. As they reach the door, a gust of cold wind crosses the corridor, bringing back the sound of whispers, now louder and more intense. The shadows begin to move again, gaining strength as they stretch across the walls, blocking the windows and doors. Upon passing through the door of the house, the group finds themselves in a dark alley, surrounded by the same shadows that seem to be reaching out to trap them. Elena, without hesitation, pulls John by the arm and points the way to the central square, where perhaps they can meet and organize themselves better. "We need to get this to a safe place. We need to meet with everyone before we act," she says, her voice low as the others nod, aware that time is running out. As they run through the deserted streets of Havenbrook, the sound of footsteps and whispers pursues them. The few remaining streetlights flicker, creating an intermittent illumination that seems to only intensify the feeling that the entity is watching them closely, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sarah, exhausted, looks over her shoulder, seeing the shadows approaching, but also feeling that the strength of the amulet's light still offers some protection, however tenuous. "We're not going to make it to the square without facing this thing again," she says, panting as she looks at the others with despair. John closes his eyes for a second, trying to stay calm. "If we stay together and protect the amulet, perhaps we can buy enough time." Elena pulls the letter out of her coat, unfolding it to read once again the section that talks about the altar hidden in the forest. She realizes that the exact location where the sacred artifact was buried is further away than they imagined, probably in an area they have never explored before. We have to find a way to outwit this entity. If we can make it to the altar, maybe we can get this over with, she says firmly as John nods. Suddenly, a scream echoes down the street next door, followed by the sound of breaking glass. The group stops abruptly, recognizing the desperate voice of a resident. Without thinking twice, Elena runs towards the sound, followed by John, Sarah, and Claire. They find an elderly woman trying to protect herself inside an abandoned store, as shadows invade the space around her, blocking all exits. John lifts the amulet once more, emitting a glow that drives away the shadows, allowing the woman to leave the place and join them. The lady, in tears, holds Elena's hand and thanks her, but her eyes show the fear of someone who saw death up close. They're everywhere, she says, her voice shaking. Go to the central square, says Elena. Find the others. We're going to need all the help we can get to resist. The lady agrees gratefully and heads towards the square, while the group watches, hoping she arrives safely. But the brief moment of relief is cut short when the shadows approach again, taking shape and enveloping the surrounding walls and posts. The entity, now visible, rises from the center of the street, watching them with red and intense eyes, as if studying each one of them. Do you think you can resist? The entity's voice echoes, reverberating through the streets. The tone of contempt and hatred in the creature's voice is palpable, and its eyes shine with an ancient, insatiable hunger. Havenbrook already belongs to me. You cannot escape the destiny you have chosen. Elena looks at the group, fierce determination on her face. She knows they need to buy time, but she also feels that this will be the final battle. Turning to the entity, she challenges, Havenbrook is not yours. And we will prove it. The entity reacts to the challenge, the shadows around it stirring like a storm ready to attack. John holds the amulet tighter, repeating the words of the mausoleum spirit. The amulet's light shines once again, temporarily repelling the entity and creating a safe corridor that allows the group to proceed to the square. Along the way, they notice that more shadows are approaching, forming barriers and trying to block the passage. Sarah and Claire stand side by side, supporting each other as they run, feeling the extreme fatigue and pressure of the fight. But the amulet's glow continues to give them a small advantage, opening up enough space for them to advance, albeit slowly. As they approach the square, they begin to hear voices and see figures who have also gathered there. Several residents, all with looks of fear and exhaustion, wait in silence, holding lanterns, candles, and anything that can generate light. The despair is evident, but the presence of Elena and her group brings a flame of hope. Elena climbs onto a stone bench, drawing everyone's attention. Listen, we know what this entity wants. We know Havenbrook is in danger. But we also know we can resist if we work together. John holds up the amulet, displaying it for all to see. This amulet still keeps the entity at bay. We need each of you to hold the light and keep the darkness from swallowing us. The group of residents approaches, each holding their lanterns and candles, forming a circle of light around the square. But the presence of the entity is palpable. They feel the whispers growing, the cold intensifying, and the shadows around them advancing, ready to attack. In the middle of the square, Elena opens the letter and reads the excerpt about the altar hidden in the forest, where the pact was originally sealed. If we can get to that altar, there is a chance to seal this entity away forever. But it will be a dangerous journey. Some residents hesitate, but most remain steadfast, aware that this may be their last chance to save Havenbrook. John and Elena organize small groups, each tasked with keeping the light on and securing the perimeter as they prepare for the next step. As they discuss the plan, the entity makes its presence felt, a gigantic, distorted shadow covering a portion of the square. The residents' voices begin to overlap in panic, but Elena raises her voice, bringing everyone back to calm. Don't give up now. This thing can't win if we stick together, she says firmly. John at his side looks up at the sky, which now seems darker and more oppressive. He feels that time is running out, and that the last opportunity to defeat the entity is quickly approaching. The central square, illuminated by every lantern and candle they carry, becomes the last stronghold of light in Havenbrook, surrounded by a darkness that seems almost alive. Elena and her group know they need to head into the forest and find the altar, but they also realize that this will mean leaving the safety of the city and facing the entity on its territory. They exchange glances, knowing there is no guarantee of return, but also aware that this is the only hope of breaking the dark cycle that haunts Havenbrook. With one last look at the residents, Elena gives the command. Let's go to the forest. Let's end this once and for all. Back in the central square, the group gathers to discuss what they discovered. They now know that they need to find the altar described in the letter and use the amulet and sacred artifact to try to seal the entity once and for all. But time is running out, and they realize that the entity is more aggressive and determined than ever. Elena looks at her friends, her face etched with exhaustion and determination. We can't let this thing continue to take over our city. Let's get this over with. John, examining the amulet which is visibly weakened, looks at Elena and the others. We need to act quickly. The entity knows what we are trying to do, and it will not let us get to the altar without a fight. Sarah and Claire nod, determined to resist until the end. Now, with one goal in mind, they prepare for the final mission, knowing that the fate of Havenbrook is in their hands. But before they leave for the forest, an icy wind runs through the square, and the entity's voice echoes once again, with even greater intensity, "You are insignificant. This city already belongs to me." Sombra Sabexo. Continue.